So I've gotten some big news in the last little while. I have been chosen as one of 5 people to be an ambassador for Mental Health Month, ACT. I'm going to put all the links and everything below in the description so you're able to find it. I'm going to talk today on the podcast about my journey as to why I tell my story and how empowering it's been to learn to tell my story, and why I think that you should tell your story in whatever capacity you have. We're going to talk about that and more on Shattered the Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to Shattered the Podcast,
sharing the lived experience of mental illness on
A father,
a mother.
a family.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go.
G'day and welcome to another Shattered the Podcast. As I mentioned, I've been chosen to be an ambassador for Mental Health Month ACT. Very, very exciting. And my fellow ambassadors are incredible. Their stories are amazing. I do encourage you, once the podcast is finished, to check the links, read through their bios, and we'll also have news on upcoming events and what we're going to be doing during Mental Health Month, which is October. All right, so today I want to talk about the importance of telling your story. When I first was injured, did not tell anybody outside of my care team that I had a mental illness. I told my immediate family and my extended family. I kind of alluded to the fact that something was wrong, that I was struggling with some issues from my work. My family knew that my workplace was a place of violence, and they knew that I got hurt a lot. They didn't know the extent of the injuries, and they didn't quite understand how serious it was when I actually was hurt in the end. As a consequence of this, or not necessarily as a consequence, but as part of this, I did not talk about my mental illness outside my immediate family. I didn't let people know. I didn't talk about it. I didn't share about it on any forums, social media or otherwise. And I certainly didn't tell it in a podcast. What happened is I got to a point where I stopped being ashamed myself, but I still didn't tell other people. I didn't tell other people outside of my circle my situation. And one of the strangest things that happened is that I'd lost a job and I'd been given a payout from that job. And my wife said, "You've got a bit of an opportunity here. What would you do if you could do anything in the world at all?" Well, I just said, I'd like to be a radio announcer. So seeing that my wife is a force of nature, and once you tell her that you want something and it's important to you and it might be helpful, well, she makes it happen. So 3 weeks later, I was volunteering at a local community radio station as an announcer. 3 months after that, I got my first full-time job as a radio announcer. You might think that being on radio is a strange place to be when you've got a mental illness, but there's 2 things about it that are awesome. 1, nobody can see you. And 2, you're sitting in a room by yourself, talking to yourself, and you're playing music. In some ways, it's the best of both worlds. Now, the thing of it is I didn't really think about the people outside of the studio. I didn't really consider that people actually listened. And it would be strange. You'd go to a supermarket or somewhere and you'd say something and people would go, "Oh, hey, are you this guy from this radio station?" You'd say, yes, I am. And they'd say something innocuous, something that they'd heard on the radio, but I didn't realize I'd said. So they'd say something along the lines of, "Hey, how's Mickey doing?" And that's my daughter, and that's one of the nicknames I have for her. And I'm meeting a stranger and I would say, And I'd be nervous. I'd be like, how the hell do you know that name? How in the hell do you know I have a daughter? Are you a stalker? And of course not. I just said something on radio and people had listened. Now, one thing I never talked about was my mental illness, ever. I would talk about it off air with guests because you're trying to build that rapport. And then one day I was interviewing a guy who was an ultra marathon runner and raising awareness of mental illness. And I, at the end of the interview, I signed off, hey, thank you so much for being on the air. Then I said, as being a person with mental illness, I really appreciate your courage. Now, I didn't realize that that's what I'd said. I came back to work the next day and I was really upset when I opened my emails because the heading was Mark and mental illness. And I'm like, man, I've been outed by someone. And I was furious. Went to the person in the station and said, who outed me? Who's gone on air and said that I have a mental illness? And we kind of listened, and in the wash, it turned out that it was me. I had done it. So anyway, I was furious. I didn't want to be on air. I didn't want to read my emails, but I put all that aside. I'm a radio professional now. I need to get the job done. And I just started reading through the emails. And the first couple were exactly what I thought. They were people being generally nice. Good on you, Mark. Thanks for saying something. And it's kind of what I expected. And it's something that I do in my mental illness, that I respond better to criticism than I do to praise. So if somebody comes to one of my talks in the schools and says, Mark, I really enjoyed your talk, you were amazing, and then walks away, that's kind of like water off a duck's back. I don't pay any attention to it. But if you happen to say, I really enjoyed your talk, but at this point you said this, and I really don't agree with that, I'm sort of like, I'm more apt, I'm more inclined to listen to what you have to say. And that's the thing that I used to do on air. It's, you'd always get comments. Oh, you're great. I love what you're doing. And you sort of just water off a duck's back. And then you get the person who calls up and says, I don't believe that you said this particular word on air because I find it offensive and you need to stop doing that. Well, I'll pay more attention and give more credence to that than I would somebody telling me I did a good job. So the first couple of emails are what I expect. Yeah, people are going to be nice. They're going to show pity on this mentally ill person. Then I kept reading. There was more and more emails. And while I was sitting there, texts were coming through and more emails were coming through. Just people thanking me for telling my story. Something fundamentally changed in my mind that day when I realized that this thing that I'd kept hidden because it was out of a motivation of shame was something that I didn't need to be ashamed about. Now, it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen that I started talking about my mental illness more, slowly, bit by bit, incrementally, until I became somebody that was seen as a vocal advocate for people suffering mental health issues. And in the beginning in the radio, you get like a little bit radio famous. So every once in a while, somebody recognizes your voice or your picture from the website. And that would happen to me a little bit. They'd hear my voice and go, oh, you're such and such from the radio station. They'd want to take a picture with you. It's weird being even just a tiny little bit famous. I don't get it. I don't like it. But it's hard not to have people that like you when you are on radio and you're on air and you love doing it. And you're good at it. And I hope that I was good at it. I hope that I still am. But anyway, people would come up and they'd want to take a photo with you and there'd be that kind of minor celebrity. But once I started talking about my mental illness, people didn't talk about that stuff. They didn't come up to me and say, Mark, I want to take a photo. They'd come up and say, Mark, I just appreciate you talking about this stuff. I appreciate the fact that you're willing to share. And so the conversations about me being on air no longer centered around what can I do to be more popular. It was around how can we talk about a different aspect of mental illness and what do we need to do that while still being entertaining and still being able to conduct a radio show. I mean, I'm on public radio. I'm not on mental health radio. So how do I incorporate my illness, my part of my story, as being the fullness of who I am? And that's what I did. And that ultimately led to this podcast. Talking about my mental illness, first of all, helped me get over my shame. But second of all, it helped empower me. One thing that happened when I had a mental illness initially is I felt kind of unworthy. And I felt like I had nothing to say and that I wasn't I wasn't like a real person anymore. I was diminished. I was less than. And that was the power of mental illness. That was the lies that my mind was telling me, saying to me that, yes, all these horrible things that you think about yourself, everybody else thinks them too because they're 100% true. So to be able to talk about my mental illness, it felt like I was taking some of that power back. That I was wrestling back some of my own self-confidence through my story and that I was taking it back from my mental illness. That, in essence, is why I believe that people should tell their story. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should get a podcast or go on radio and tell their story. I'm talking about just in your circle of influence. Whatever genre or milieu that you have, maybe you're an artist, maybe you're just a normal person that doesn't like to talk to people, maybe you're just a regular person. In your conversations, don't be afraid of your mental illness. Don't be ashamed about it and do talk about it. Something came up the other day. We were watching a show and they were talking about how this person was mental. Shocking word to use. And we paused it because my kids kind of looked a little confused. And we just stopped it and we just talked about the fact that, okay, the way that they're using it in the show is unrealistic and this is why. That's perpetuating the conversation about mental illness so that hopefully my kids will be at a point in their ages where they don't feel like they have to hide it. I had to become an old man to figure out that I could talk about my mental illness. They're still teenagers, but if they can learn that the conversation is not bad, that they're not less than because they have mental health issues, or that their friends are not weak because they have mental illness problems, that is my message. And that's what I want to do. And that's why I encourage you to tell your story. Take some of that power back. Allow yourself to be powerful. Allow yourself to conquer the stigma, the self-stigma that you may have about your mental illness. And if you change, and if I change, and if another person changes, then eventually these conversations won't be hard to have. You'll be able to call up work the same as you would if you had a broken leg. Mate, I broke my leg. I can't come into work today. Cool. No worries. We get it. Hey, I'm having a mental health issue. I've got to take today off. Sure. No worries. We understand. We'll see you when you're well. Imagine that is the power of you talking about your mental illness down the line. One day, it'll become something that isn't a stigma or a stain or something you need to be ashamed of. Well, that is the reason that I encourage you to talk about your mental illness. Don't forget, as a mental health ACT ambassador, one of 5, I'm excited to be able to share a lot of things that we're going to be doing through the month of October. As I said, all the links are below. My book is available for $4 on Amazon. The link is below for that. Like, subscribe, and share. Have a great day. I will talk to you again soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Shattered the Podcast. I'd like to thank our producer, Meredith Brosnan, our executive producer, Torian Lau, and the band Adelaide for allowing us to use their song as our theme. Go to shatteredthepodcast.com for more information.